So we talked about layout types. Now let's actually go build a float layout. And in order to do so, you will learn how to build your very own simple fluid grid that you can use on a small web page like this. And so in this lecture, you're actually going to learn a bunch of new stuff. Firstly, how we should architect and build a simple grid system. And in order to do that, you'll learn how the attribute selector works, how the powerful not pseudo-class works in CSS, and how the calc function works. And also what's the difference between calc and simple SAS mathematical operations. So a lot for one lecture, so let's get our hands dirty now. Now before we start, what is a grid actually? Well, a grid is just a design system which allows us to build consistent interfaces. So this kind of grid will allow us to divide our available space in 2 equal parts, in 3 equal parts, or in 4 equal parts, or even something like this, with 1/3 on one side and 2/3 on the other side. And this leads to way more consistent designs, and so now it's really become like a standard in web design. So everyone really uses a grid like this. You also see that there's a consistent space here between all of these columns, so we always have this space here, which is called the gutter actually. And so once again, the grid is designed to allow us to build consistent interfaces. So here you can see all the different elements that we're going to have in our very small grid. So we have one configuration with 2 columns here, then we will have a configuration with 3 columns, like these ones here, and then one configuration with 4 columns. Okay? Now if you wanted to do more, like 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, or even more, then the logic that we use here for these columns is the same, like extending it to even more columns. But for this example and for this project, 4 different columns is more than enough. Now in the 3-column configuration, we also have this column here, which actually spans over 2 of the single columns. So you see this one here spans over these 2 here, right? And so we could then put 1/3 on this side and 2/3 on the other side, if that's a layout that we want to build. And then for the 4-column configuration down here, we have one column that spans over 2 of these. So this one here spans over these 2 basically, in case you need a layout like that. So for example 1, 1, 2, or you could have 1, 2, and then 1 again, so to have a bigger column in the middle like this one. And then finally we also have a column which spans over 3 of the individual columns here, which is this one. So these are all the different configurations. Now the columns, they always should be in a container, and this container is what we call a row. So this one here is a row for these 2 columns, then here is a row for these 3 columns, this one is a row for these 2 columns, and so on and so forth. So all columns that are, let's say, in a line, they are in one row always, okay? So we have to build rows and columns. So let's now code up this grid system here, okay? This shouldn't be all too hard. There's actually a lot of advanced CSS involved here, but I'm sure you're gonna master that, right? For now, let's see if our page is actually still working. And you see something is strange here, so let's check what's wrong. And I suspect that it's actually once again here some problem, and yeah, that's right. So something here went wrong again. So let me close this and open a new tab and restart the process. So npm run compile CSS, I think that's the name of the, let's take a look, compile SAS, okay. Then we need to make some change, okay. Now it run, and okay, so everything looks normal, okay. Now before we actually start writing the CSS, let's start by writing the HTML markup to have something similar to this. Okay. Now this is of course only for testing purposes. We don't want anything here like this on our web page, right? So starting then with the HTML, let's put it here after the header, okay? So let's just put a section here just to test our grid, okay? Class grid test, okay? Now in here we're gonna have a couple of rows, of course. So div class row, and then these columns. So the first type of columns, I'm going to call it col1 of 2. And that's the text I'm going to put in there so that we can nicely see what we're actually talking about. And then the second column. So these two here will basically become these two later when we have the CSS in place. And now let's make this part here. So as I was saying, these columns are always in a row, okay? And so these are going to be called 1 of 3, 1 of 3, and then of course we're going to have 3 as well. So I was missing this part here. So call 1 of 3. And now we also have this one here, right? So column 2 of 3, which spans over these two here. So another row, of course. And again, this is just for testing purposes. We're not going to have this one here in our design. So 2, and then here 2. So you see the logic? This one is one part of a 3-part grid, and this here is basically 2 parts of the 3-part grid. Okay, so this one here. And now finally the last one. Actually, let me copy this one because it's more similar already to what we have. Just copy this one. And then I use this trick where I select all the 3s by hitting Command D and 4. Okay? And now all we have to do is to make this line here and this line. So this is a 1 of 2, and this is a 3 of 4. Actually, this is 2 of 4, of course, sorry for the mistake. So column 2 of 4, it's a 1 plus 1 plus 2 makes the 4, right? And then finally, the last one, where we have 3. So 1 plus 3 makes the total of 4. So this is our HTML markup so that we can test our classes. So we're now ready to go to work with our CSS. And as you can probably guess, we are going to make a whole new Sass file to build this grid, okay? And since this is actually a layout part, so part of the layout, we will put it in the layout folder. So we do a new partial here, SCSS, and then we import it here, of course, in the main file. Alright, so starting with the row. First off, we need to define a width for the row. And one of the standards that is used these days is to make a 1140 pixels grid. Okay, so width 1140 pixels. Now, what's wrong with this? I'm sure that you guessed it. That's right, we want to use rems and not pixels. And so all we have to do is to divide this number by 10, because we already know that 10 pixels equals 1 rem, right? So 140 rem. But it's still not perfect, because what we actually want is not width, but max width. And what's the difference between width and max width? Let me actually show it to you in here. So the max width of this is 1140 pixels, right? Now decrease the screen like this, then you will see that everything starts to adapt to the width of the screen. So what max So what max width means is that if we have enough available space, then it will have the width that we specified. But if there's not enough width, so basically if the viewport is smaller than the width that we specified here, so in this case, if the viewport is smaller than 114 rem, then it will simply fill 100% of the available space that it has. Okay? Let's actually give it some kind of background color just so that we can see what's going on. So background color, I'm going to give it a nice gray here. Okay? And the last thing we want to do is to always center this row in the viewport. So how do we do that? And probably you already know the trick, right? So what we do is margin, 0, and auto. And that's the trick that everyone uses to center block elements inside of another block element. So we say that the margin on top and of the bottom is 0, and left and right is auto. And why does that actually work? Well, when we say that we want the margin to be automatically, this means that the browser, when rendering the page, will automatically figure out the margin that we want on the left and on the right side, right? And since it's both set to auto, it means that left and right will be the same. And CSS will automatically calculate the left margin and the right margin, and they will be the same. And so, of course, the element will be centered. So that's the simple logic behind this. And let's now actually check out our page. And well, something is not working again. Let me check out what's going on. Again, this error here, okay? So let me run it again. I should probably change the autosave function in my code editor. I'm going to do that later. All right, and now here we go. So we have our column with this nice width, and it's also centered in the browser. So perfect. Let's just inspect it so we can see. All right, so up there you see it's actually 1140 pixels wide. Now, one other thing that we should also do about these rows is that we should have some space, some gutter between these rows. So imagine we have a layout and then we have multiple rows, and we naturally want some space between them, right? So let's take care of that. And so we say margin bottom of, let's say, 80 pixels. Now these values that we're specifying here, like this max width and this margins, they are great candidates for specifying a variable so that we have one place in the variable files where we can easily change all of these values by simply changing one variable. So let's actually do that by opening this file. And now starting to organize this a bit, let's put some comments here. So these are colors, okay? And now down here, we will have variables for our grid. So let's say grid width. So remember 114 RAM. And if one day in the future we want to change this, we don't have to search through all the files. We simply can change it here in the variables file, okay? And now I will also specify a variable called gutter vertical and set it to the 80 pixels, that we had before, which is equivalent to 8 RAM. And since we're at it, I can also specify the horizontal gutter, right? And I will set this to 60 pixels, so 6 RAM. And the horizontal gutter is, of course, it's these spaces here in between the columns. And this is even better to have as a variable, because once we start specifying these gutters and these columns, we will use this value over and over again. And so this is a perfect candidate for a SAS variable. Okay, so let's now just go ahead and actually use these. It's grid width. And then here, it's a gutter vertical. All right, so let's check it out. And yep, so here we go. Actually show you something, because you see this is the last row here, okay? So between all these rows we have a margin, and then also, of course, the last one. Now this doesn't make much sense, okay? So we want the last one not to have a margin in the bottom. So let's simply remove that, and I'm sure you know a good way of doing that. So what would that way be? It would be simply to use the last child Pseudo-Class and then set the margin bottom to 0 on that one, right? But we can do even better. And what I mean is to use the not pseudo selector. So let me show you how it works. So we can use it on the row. And so you already know by now that we can then use the ampersand operator. And then we set the not pseudo class. So we have row not. So of course, let me just show it to you again, just to make sure we're on the same page here. So this is what we have here, right? So row not. And now what we can do here is to specify another pseudo class in here. So let me first show it to you and then explain it. So last child. Now let's duplicate here. Okay. All right. So what does this not here actually do? Now without the not, this would simply select the last child, right? So if we had this last child, then we would simply select the last child, so the last row element. Now what the not does here is that it simply does the opposite. So we select everything except the last child. So it's basically just the opposite. Instead of selecting the last child, we select everything except the last child, right? And so what we can do now is to simply put this margin bottom in here. And that's it. So now instead of setting the vertical gutter here, these 80 pixels, on all of these rows, we put it on all the rows except the last child. So this is what the not here does. Everything except the last child. Okay? Does that make sense? So another very powerful pseudo-class that you just learned here. And let's check it out. And indeed, it is now gone. So really cool. And you see it apply here. At least you should see, it should be somewhere here. Well, it's actually not. Of course it's not. It is in these ones here. Okay. So here you have row, not, last child, margin bottom. So these ones, of course, have the margin bottom. And then only this last one does not have that declaration block. All right, cool. Now we're ready to work on the columns. Let's start with the very first column, which is the column 1 of 2. Okay? And since we always have these columns inside of rows, we can actually nest it here inside of the row selector, right? So call 1 of 2. And so this will translate to a column which is always inside of a row. Okay, and so now how do we actually define the width of this column? Let's take a look here at the example. So what is the width of this column here? It is very simply the entire width of this row, right, minus this gutter, this space here, okay, divided by 2, right? So again, this entire space here, ranging from the left side all the way to the right side here, is 100%, okay? If we then subtract this gutter space here, we end up with the entire space that these two columns can occupy. And if we then divide that in two parts, we end up with the width of one of the columns, okay? And that's exactly what we want. So let's do that in CSS. Now, how do we actually do these calculations? Well, in CSS, there is an extremely powerful function which is called calc. And in here, you can do mathematical operations and you can actually mix units in here. And that's really important. It's a huge advantage. So again, this allows us to make calculations where we can mix units. And that's a big difference between doing native CSS calculations or doing them in Sass. Because in Sass, we can also do operations, of course, but we cannot do them with multiple units. So we cannot, for example, mix RAM with pixels with percentages. And it's actually pretty logical why it is that way. And it is so because we compile our Sass file while we're developing the page. So even before the page is served, of course, to the user. But this kind of calculation all depends on the layout. So it has to happen while the website is rendered using the visual formatting model. So that's when these calculations can occur. Because it's only then when CSS and when the browser knows what a percentage is, what a RAM is, and what all of that stuff is. Okay? So we have to do it using the native calc functions. And so let's now translate what we were saying earlier. So we have 100% of the width, okay? And from that, we subtract the gutter. So the gutter that we have is called gutter horizontal, remember? And then we simply have to divide all of this in two parts. So if you know any math, we have to put these parentheses here so that it first does this calculations, so this calculation here, so 100 minus the gutter, okay, so we put it into parentheses so that this operation happens first, and then the result of that will be divided by 2. Okay, but that's actually not enough to make this working, because in the calc function in CSS, if we want to use a Sass variable, we have to actually do this little thing, so we have to use the hash, and then wrap it into these curly braces. Okay, and with this, it will actually work. Okay, so let's now give this the background color so we can see it. Let's use orange red here just for exemplification. Then of course we also want to actually see the gutter, right? So we want a margin on the right side of the column, which will then be the gutter. Now remember that there's only one gutter here, right? So in the case of the 1-2 column, it's only in the first one. So this gutter here will be the right margin of this first column here. And then when we do these columns here, then this gutter will be the right margin of this column, and this gutter will be the right margin of this column. And so we always want the right margin to be on all of the columns except the last one. And that's exactly what we did with the row before, right? So let's now do that. And so once again, we can use the not pseudo-class. Then in here, we can use the last child. So margin right and gutter horizontal. All right, and so our columns also have a gutter now, so a margin right. Now only one thing left, which since we're using a float layout here, of course we need to float these columns. Okay, so we use float left. So we always float all these columns to the left side. And so now like this, we are ready to actually take a look at our result. And yeah, so wow, it's actually working already. So our first column, our gutter, and our second column. Let's actually inspect this one. So here you have the margin right of 6 rem, which is the horizontal gutter that we defined. And here you saw the selector that we built. So the column 1 of 2, which is inside of a row element, and then not the last child, right? Okay, now just one thing that I want to show you is that this row here has a 0 pixel height. And I'm sure you know why that happens. And it is because all of the child elements of this row element are floated, and so the height collapses and becomes 0. And what do we do against that? That's right, we use the clear fix hack. And we already did that once actually in our initial SAS lectures, and so let's do that again. And remember that by then we used a SAS mixin, right? So a reusable piece of code that we could then add here to this row declaration block. So let me show you again how it works. So let's write our first mixin here in the mixins file. So a mixin always starts with us writing mixin, then the name of the mixin, which is clearfix in this case, clearfix, and then what do we want this clearfix to actually do? So how does the clearfix actually work? So what the clearfix does is to append a pseudo element after the element, which will then clear these floats. And so what we can do is to use the ampersand operator and then after. All right, so once we're going to include this mixin here in our grid, right, it will then simply copy this code here. And so this ampersand that we're writing in the mixin then will transform to row. So it will then be something like this, just to show it to you. After, and then all the code that we're going to write. So let's do that. So how does the clearfix work? Again, we always need to specify the content property, otherwise a pseudo element will simply not appear on the page. And we want it empty because we don't want to see this element on the page. Then we also need to display it. And the way it's done is to use the table value in here. So that's simply the standard version of the clearfix, so display table. And then finally the property that actually performs this clearfix is the clear property. And so this will clear both floats, so float left and float right. So that it's going to work no matter if we use float left or float right. And that's actually it. All right, so let's now include the mixin in here. And let me actually put it here before these columns. So include clearfix. And that should do the trick. Let's check it out. And yeah, I think it looks different. And so yeah, here we go. So our row now has again a complete height with 17 pixels in this case. So we cleared the float. We already have the 1 of 2 columns nicely set up. So let's now move on to the next type of columns. And so all we have to do in order to finish this lecture is now code up all of these different columns, which shouldn't be all too hard. Okay, So let's now do that. So let's start with call 1 of 3. And so how is the with going to work this time? Let us take a look, actually. Okay? So this is actually pretty similar to what we had before. So we have 100%, and if we subtract this gutter and this gutter, and then divide the result by 3, because now we have 3 columns, then we end up with the width of one of the columns, right? So it's very similar to the one that we had before, and so let's do that. So 100% minus, and now 2 times the gutter horizontal. And here this part is missing. And now divide this result by 3, because this time we have, of course, 3 columns. Alright? And now this stuff here is actually the same. Now, of course, I should not simply copy this code here into this column, right? Really against the don't repeat yourself practice, okay? And we're also not going to do one of the solutions that I mentioned earlier, something like a mix-in or something like that. That also doesn't make much sense here. Instead, what we want to do is to basically select all of the columns at the same time and then apply these styles to all these columns. So let me show you, I think, the best way to do that. And for that, we're going to use the attribute selector. Okay, so let's do that here. Now we could, of course, go ahead and add a new class to all of these columns. So we could add something like simply call, and then select that, and then have a specific style only for call 1 of 4. But that again would be a bit too much, I think. So I prefer to use the selector that I'm going to show you, which is the attribute selector. And so we start with the brackets, okay, so like this, and then in here we can specify an attribute. And so for example, we could put source, if we wanted, just an example. So source is an attribute of the image. For example, let's see, so this here, for example, this image has the source of image logo white. And so we could now select all of the elements that have this exact source. Or we could also select by alt. So we could say something like alt logo. And actually, let's do that. So we could do something like this. And this would basically select all of the elements which have this alt attribute equal to logo. Now in this case, that's not what we want at all, obviously. What we want is to select based on class. Now, why do we select based on class if we could simply do it with a dot, right? But let me show you, because what we can do also here is to not just select equal, but we can do something like this. For example, this symbol here means that we want the beginning to be what we set here. So let's set this one to call dash, and that is it. So what does this do? It will select all of the elements in which the class attribute starts, and that's what this symbol here means. So where all the class attributes start with call. And that is exactly our case, right? So we have all the columns starting with call dash. So call dash 1 and 1, and you see all of these are selected. And so this is a nice way to select all of the columns at the same time. So again, the magic happens actually here with this symbol. So this allows us to select only the ones that start with call dash. Now we can use other symbols here, so other selectors here as well. So instead of this, we could have the asterisk. And what this would mean is that select any classes which contain this part call. Okay? But that's not what we want, because this could lead to some mistakes maybe. And so we only really want the ones that start with call. Actually, there's another one. So you could put this sign here, so like the $sign. And then it would mean any class that ends with call dash. So we can do start with call, end with call, or simply contain call. Okay? But what we want here is this. Now there are a lot of applications for this selector here. For example, we could also select links based on a specific href attribute, or we could also select anchor elements which have their target attribute set to blank. So these are the links that open in a new tab when we click them, and we could then style these ones differently than the regular links. And so there's a whole lot of applications for this kind of selector. So keep this one in mind when you start building your own pages. Now what we really wanted to do here is to actually pass all of this in here, right? So now all of the classes that we have will have this float property set to left, so they will be floated to the left, and also they will have their right margin set to this gutter that we specified, but only all except the last one, which is what this not does here. Alright, and if we now check out, alright, so here we go. Our 1 of 3 columns are now also working, and you see that already it styled these remaining columns with the color that we specified, and also with the gutter, right? So all we have to really do next is to specify their width, okay? Now just to show you, let me show you, for example, so here is that selector that we just wrote before. So it selects first the row, and then in there, all the elements with the class starting with call dash. And so you saw that this really worked. Okay, let's continue with the 1 of 4, and then in the end we will do the intermediate ones, 2 of 3 and the other ones as well. So how is this one going to work? Well, again, very similar to the other ones. So this time we have 3 gutters, of course, and then we simply divide it by 4 because we have 4 columns. Very simple, right? And so you see that it's already working in here. Now all we have to do is to specify this, this, and this remaining columns. So let's actually copy this. 2 of 3. And now it actually gets a bit more complicated. So what is the width of this kind of column? So let's check it out here in our example. Okay. So what is the width of this column? Can you see it? And actually it's easy to see it up here. So the width of this column is the width of the normal column, so of the 1 of 3 column, plus another of these columns, so 2 times this column plus the gutter. And that's actually it. So all we have to do is now translate this to code. So again, the width of this column is this one plus the gutter. So let's do that. And so what we have here already is actually the width of one of the columns, right? So let's simply wrap that in parentheses. All right. And multiply it by 2. So 2 times the width of the simple column plus the gutter width. And that should be it. So again, we simply multiply 2 times the width of the single 1 of 3 column, so this one here, we multiply it by 2 and then add the gutter width, which is exactly what we discussed a bit earlier. So let's take a look. And well, something is not really working here. Let's take a look. What's happening? Well, something is not right. I see. Okay, of course I misspelled this word here. It's not width, it's of course horizontal. Okay, sorry about that one. And now of course it's working. So this column plus this gutter makes this column here. And so let's do now the same thing for the col 2 of 4, which actually is the same. So 1 of 4 plus 1 of 4 plus this gutter will make this 2 of 4 column. All right, so let's do that. So col 2 of 4, and so let's have 2 times, open parentheses, and then close them here. So always be careful with the parentheses, and then we simply add the gutter again. And let's just copy it so that I don't make the same mistake again. And so yeah, let's check it out. And here we go. So everything's working. And so now there's only one left, which is a 3 of 4. The logic now is actually pretty similar. So the 3 of 4 is the same as having this column plus this one plus this one plus this gutter and this gutter. Okay, so 3 times the 1 of 4 column plus 2 times the gutter. So let's just copy all of this. 3. Then here, remember we multiplied by 3 now. and then 2 times the gutter. And that's it. And indeed, it is now working just fine. And so with this, we actually already have our grid system in place, meaning that we are now ready to use it in the rest of the project. Now I know that this math here that we did can seem a bit scary, but once you understand it, it's really no problem. And since you now know how to do it, you can simply copy it for next time, so for your next project, and then use it. So it's way better to use your own stuff, at least that's my opinion, and know exactly how it works and what you're doing, instead of always relying on some third-party external stuff. At least that is my opinion. Now, if you think that this gutter is maybe too large or too small, then again, if you have another project with some other requirements, you can very simply come here and change it. So for example, imagine we want a bigger gutter. So all we have to do is to increase it, and now you see the gutter is really huge. Or if it's too big, then you can just put it to something really small, like 2. You can come here and you have smaller gutters. So that is the power of CSS variables. Changing one value in one place, and then it takes effects on the entire page, everywhere where you used this variable, okay? So our grid system is now in place. Let's just hide this CSS here from our page, because we don't really want to see this, right? So HTML comments, they work like this. And now at the end, we just close them like this. And that's it. So now we commented out our code, and so each time that we want to now use one of these columns or one of these rows with the columns inside, we can come here and copy them and just use our grid as we intended. Alright, so this was essential in order to move on, and also for you on the way to becoming a more advanced CSS developer. So now you really know how grids are configured and how they work, and how you could easily build your own.